All right, so we're talking about original American removal and settlement. Our objective is how does Andrew Jackson and others affect original Americans, African Americans, and European Americans? The big idea is that Jackson forced many tribes, including the Cherokee, Choctaw, Sacs, Creek, and Fox, to leave their land. It led to violence within the tribes as they fought to decide whether to move or not, as well as with the soldiers who had to force them to move. For example, the Creek left with chains wrapped around their necks. The soldiers would shoot anybody who objected, at anything. And there was many deaths. There was a lot of starvation, and there was a lot of disease due to the journey. It affected African Americans and the fact that slavery expanded the West, and it helped lead to the Civil War. For European Americans, they benefited from the land that was given to them for super cheap, thanks to this land that was bought for basically nothing. And the original Americans, they lost a lot of really good farmland, they lost their homes, and they lost a lot of people. So a little bit about the background is that Andrew Jackson became president, and then he believed that the government had the right to regulate where the original Americans lived. The Cherokees, the Shawnees, and others had migrated across the Mississippi to avoid warfare. So they had already been living in really eastern Carolinas and Tennessee and other places. So they decided to get out and avoid the westward expansion, just move to some land where they thought that people wouldn't bother them anymore. So they went to Georgia, where not a lot of people were really interested in the land, in Tennessee and Mississippi. And the government was super pleased by this. They thought, great idea, you're getting out of our way, we really appreciate that. Unfortunately, the production of cotton led to the desire for the land that they lived on. Not only that, but there was also gold that was discovered. And that led to a super rush to acquire this land. Now, another thing to know is that the Cherokees and others had really tried to blend in also to their European American way. They'd converted themselves to Christianity, they had learned English, they had their own law code and their own alphabet. So this is the picture of Cherokee. So you notice they're wearing jackets, they're wearing white colored shirts. Except for the color of their skin, they look like European Americans. They also developed their own alphabet for the Cherokee language, developed in part by Sequoyah, who was one of the greatest Cherokee leaders. Jackson, however, decided because there was gold, he wanted the land. He also wanted the land for people to, for cotton and owning slaves. So he issued what was called his Indian Removal Policy, or his Indian Removal Act. It was to move out the tribes, and some followed. Some did it on their own because they decided that was going to be more peaceful and they were going to lose less people. But some people decided to make a statement and put up a statement, and so they were forced. The Creeks were led out with chains around their necks. The Cherokee continued to resist. They sent a minister to appeal the decision to the Supreme Court. He was happy to do it. And in fact, the Supreme Court ruled Jackson's policies unconstitutional. It was a case called Worcester versus Georgia. And it was a really, really sad moment. For the Cherokee, their legal position was totally vindicated, which means that the Supreme Court totally decided that Jackson's policies were unconstitutional. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court doesn't have any way to enforce that. So Jackson ignored the Supreme Court and set the U.S. military to round up the Cherokees. So 70,000 troops rounded the Cherokees and forced them to leave. They were like driven. It says here, I saw the helpless Cherokee arrested and dragged from their homes, driven at bayonet point into the stockades. In the chill of a drizzling rain on October morning, I saw them loaded like cattle or sheep in his 645 wagons and started towards the west. One can never forget the sadness and solemnity of that morning. Chief John Ross read in prayer when the bugles sounded and the wagons started rolling. Many of the children rose to their feet and waved their little hands goodbye to their mountain homes, knowing they would leave them forever. Many of these helpless people did not have blankets, and many of them had been driven from home barefooted. Reverend Evan Jones said, the Cherokees are nearly all prisoners. They've been dragged from their homes and encamped at the fort and military places all over the nation. In Georgia especially, multitudes were allowed no time to take anything with them except the clothes they had on. Females who had been used to comforts and comparative affluence were driven on foot before the bayonets of brutal men. It is a painful sight. The property of many has been taken and sold before the eyes for almost nothing. The sellers and buyers, in many cases, combine to cheat the poor Indians. The poor captive in a state of distressing agitation is weeping white, almost frantic with terror, surrounded by a group of crying, terrified children. Without a friend to speak a consoling soul, is in a poor condition to make a good group of his property. In most cases, is stripped of the whole at one blow. Many of the Cherokees who were a few days ago were in comfort circumstances are now victims of abject poverty. So they were herded into concentration camps and stockades. Before then, they were forced to march. Thousands died just in the concentration camps before they were forced to march. They had to march more than 1,000 miles without slowing down for exhaustion or illness, and so they just died. At least 25% of them died, and they were resettled in Oklahoma. This is the map that shows where they were forced to march from the Tennessee, Carolinas, and Georgia, Alabamas, and forced to walk. Many did persevere. This girl is a modern example of the Cherokee Nation that still exists in Oklahoma and other states. So they do live on, despite all these hardships. They had to deal, though, when they got there, when they landed. They were fighting in anger with the tribe for the many different views of the tribal leaders. So some wanted to sign the treaty and some didn't, and so they fought and were violent against each other. Starvation, disease, and lack of good farmland caused them to have a really hard time to grow the food, and it made it really hard to survive in the Western land. And also, they were on other people's land at the same time they got there, and there was other people already pushed onto those reservations' lands, and so they had to fight with them to survive because those tribes didn't appreciate them going there and being in their, what they considered now their land, and had been promised their land. So that was really difficult. So again, just to repeat, the big idea is that this was a way that our slavery expanded and we lead to the Civil War, that the European Americans benefited from the land and given it to them for super cheap. And the original Americans, they lost a lot of really good land, homes, and people. So this is one of the major slides that you need to make sure is in your notes. You can watch a couple of videos on YouTube from the PBS series We Shall Remain that helps dramatize these events. You can click on these links to get those.